Hello everyone, this is John Mark Johnson Jr. again, and today I'm going to be talking about biblical manuscript reliability, and I'm going to be addressing this topic from a few different angles. Just go into the first slide here. There's three main things that I want to cover in this presentation, and so I'll probably break it up into three different videos and give each one separately, just because otherwise it's going to get to be really long, and I don't think that anyone would really have the time to sit down and listen to it all in one go. So I'm going to break it up in the hopes that it'll be a little bit easier to synthesize that way, a little bit easier to digest if it's broken up. But anyways, here's the three things that I want to talk about. First, I want to talk about overall reliability. That's a fairly important question, and I'm going to break it down into two subparts, and that is basically a historical attestation, and then also a particular claim that is common about the Bible that's out there, and that is that what we have is just copies of copies of copies, and that's kind of an interesting claim, and so I want to make sure that we address that. And so that's the overall reliability category. And then after I get done presenting on that, which is what I'm going to do today with you guys, so the next time that I present, I'm going to be presenting on the amount of variation and significance. That is, we're specifically going to talk about what a variant actually is, and then we're also going to talk about putting a specific number, a specific confidence level on reconstructed text, and our text that we're going to use is the UBS 5. And I'll explain more about what that is and what that means when we get to that. And then finally, last but certainly not least, I'm going to talk about some of the notable variants that occur in the biblical manuscripts that show up in various translations, particularly English translations, that is, in different English translations of the Bible. And I will be covering both some Old Testament ones and some New Testament ones. Most of the time when we talk about biblical manuscript reliability, us as Christians, I mean, we tend to focus on the New Testament, and frankly that concerns me a little bit, but after going through and looking at this material, I found out pretty quickly why most of the presentations are on the New Testament, and that is simply because we don't have a whole lot of data on the Old Testament. We got plenty of manuscripts and that kind of stuff, but people just haven't been as interested in going through and collating specific numbers for it like they are with the New Testament. And so when we are able to deliver a hard number on something, it's usually with the New Testament over the Old Testament, just because that's how it is. But when we talk about the notable variants, I will talk about a few of the Old Testament variants that are notable and that people are apt to notice. And I also, of course, talk about some of the most famous New Testament variants as well. And hopefully, if you guys are able to stick through all of this, you'll be able to get to that part, and it'll be a good experience for you, and that you'll be able to see a lot of this stuff, and you'll be able to see a lot of this stuff from a Christian perspective. It sometimes amazes folks that Christians can be aware of all of this stuff and yet not stop being a Christian, and it doesn't mean that we compromise on any of the fundamental doctrines of the Christian faith or anything like that. Just using myself as an example, I am aware of these issues, but that doesn't mean that I don't hold to sola scriptura, for example, anymore. I am a low church Christian, and I dogmatically defend sola scriptura against other systems. Just because there are issues that we have to address does not mean that our faith has suddenly in jeopardy. And so hopefully as we go through this, you'll understand why Christians can both know this kind of stuff and understand this kind of stuff without feeling that it's a threat to their Christianity in any way. And despite what some skeptics of the faith really try to claim, it really doesn't impact the faith as much as some people think that it does. So let's go ahead and get right into this. Like I said, the first thing that we're going to cover is the overall reliability. So just by way of introduction here, third slide, let's take a look at a quote from Bart Ehrman. This is in his book, Jesus Interrupted. which came out in 2009, and it's from the first chapter, which is entitled "A Historical Assault on Faith," which pretty much lets you know exactly where Bart Ehrman was coming from. He was an evangelical Christian, and he left the faith and became an agnostic. And this is what he had to say regarding the state of Christianity, and especially the state of Christian leaders. He says, "One of the most amazing and perplexing features of mainstream Christianity is that seminarians," that is, those people who go off to seminary to study Christianity, he says that these people learn that we don't have the original copies of any of the biblical books, but only copies made centuries later, all of which have been altered. They learn all this, and yet, when they enter church ministry, they appear to put it on the back shelf." That is a pretty critical viewpoint right there, and definitely not exactly flattering. So, on to the next slide here, slide 4. In light of what Ehrman and others have said, we have a question that we have to address, and this first question that we have to address is pretty straightforward. It's, how does the Bible compare to other ancient records regarding its historical attestation? That is, they say, we're pretty far out, and not only are we far out, but we also know that there are alterations that have been made. So how does this impact our understanding of the text? That is, does it make the text unreliable, or doesn't it, and those kinds of things. And when you're talking about this, comparatively speaking with other ancient documents, what you're talking about are two things specifically. One is the gap size. That is, what is the distance in time from when a work was completed to when we actually get a manuscript, our first extant manuscript from it. That is, you might have something that was written, say, in the 8th century BC, but our manuscripts of it don't come from the 8th century BC. They might have been manuscripts that were written much later. They might be from, say, the 1st century AD, which would be a pretty considerable gap in time. And this happens with a lot of ancient documents. In fact, pretty much every work of ancient antiquity we do not have originals for. Now, you could take maybe coin inscriptions and those kinds of things, because sometimes the coins will last the entire length. But unless it's a relatively solid material like that, and also relatively portable, and not something that people are going to be tempted to melt down or something, a lot of times the originals simply don't survive, and that's true of anything. But one of the questions that does get asked is how much time went on between when it was written and we start getting manuscripts from it. Because the more time in between, the more time that things could have been changed. And then another question that goes along with that is, how likely is it that the original material is represented in what we now have? So the first question is basically, what's the gap size? What's the time that's taken place between when it was written and when we get a manuscript from it? And then the other question is, from those manuscripts that we do have, how likely are they to represent what was there originally? And to measure that, we basically use the number of manuscripts. That is, the more manuscripts you have, and particularly the more manuscripts that you have that come from different places, the more likely you are to be able to reconstruct the original text. That is, let's say you only had one manuscript that came from one particular area. Well, that represents what was told in that particular area, but that one particular area, for whatever reason, historically might have changed some things. Maybe they didn't like how the story was told, and so they told it in a way that matched their expectations and the way that they like things to go. For example, most of the Roman gods are based on the Greek gods, but they're not exactly the same. The Greek legends were retold with a Roman flair. That is, the Romans didn't quite like how the stories were originally, and so they altered them to suit their particular tastes. And this is something that can happen. And so when it comes to manuscripts, well, the same thing can happen with manuscripts. Scribes might alter things from time to time. And so this group over here is altering things this way, this group over here might alter things this way, this other group over here might alter things yet another way. And if you only have one group's alterations, you're not going to have any idea of what the original was. But if you have all of the different groups, even if they do have alterations, the nice thing about it is if they are different groups, they're going to have different alterations, typically in different places. And because they differ in different places, you can compare them to one another, and you can actually get a really good idea of what the original was like. And so one of the things that we do is say, how much manuscripts do we have, and also how diverse are they? Do they come from a lot of different places, or do they primarily come from just one place? And that kind of thing. So manuscript diversity is basically represented with how many manuscripts overall you have. The more manuscripts, typically the more diverse your representation is, typically the better chance you are going to have of reconstructing the original text. So the question then becomes, how does that actually compare with other ancient documents? So on slide 5 here, we have some religious documents and some historical documents, some literary documents, and of course that kind of thing that come from different eras. And down at the bottom, you'll see the Old Testament and the New Testament. Their gap size is 3 centuries and 1 century. That is 3-century gap size for the Old Testament and 1-century gap size for the New Testament. That is, our first extant manuscripts are actually pretty close to the time that they were originally written. And then also you'll see that the number of manuscripts that we have for them is huge by comparison to anything on the list. For the Old Testament, we have over 12,500 manuscripts. For the New Testament, 24,000. It's just huge. Now compare that with the nearest contender as far as historical attestation is concerned, and that's the Quran. It only has a 1-century gap size, and as far as manuscripts that I have been able to verify, sometimes Muslim apologists will claim a much higher number of manuscripts, but for the ones that I have actually been able to get decent numbers on, it's 2,940 manuscripts, which is still quite a lot. Don't get me wrong, for almost any work anywhere, over 2,000 manuscripts is pretty phenomenal. And so that's pretty good support. But one thing you have to remember about the difference between the Quran and the Bible is that the Quran is actually a medieval document. The Bible is from ancient antiquity. And so it's kind of a comparison of apples and oranges. You're not comparing things that come from the same time period. And what's amazing about that is that the Bible, Old Testament and New Testament, actually come out around the same on that one. That is, while the Old Testament has a little bit larger gap size than the Quran does, that it's 3 centuries removed, whereas the Quran is 1 century removed. You'll notice that isn't that big of a difference compared to some of the other numbers that are on the list, and that the number of manuscripts is still well more than the Quran, at least for the data that we have now. It's hard to get good solid data on the Quran just because there aren't a lot of places that collate it and that kind of thing, and Muslims don't tend to be super interested in reconstructing their text because they believe that their text was delivered infallibly, so why go back and try to reconstruct it? But as far as other historical documents, and we're not necessarily talking about religious documents, but say like different histories and whatnot, like those that come from Livy or Herodotus. Herodotus is a famous historian, sometimes called the father of modern history, and Thucydides and Suetonius and Tacitus, or even Homer, and you'll see that the gap size is actually comparatively large. Now there are some ancient authors that have really large gap sizes. Sometimes we're waiting over a millennium for them, for a manuscript from them. That is, we just don't have manuscripts that come any earlier than that, but they wrote well ahead of when these manuscripts were written that we do have. And I mean, the gap size is just phenomenal sometimes. But you'll notice that the Bible, the Old Testament and the New Testament, are not like that. And then you'll also notice that the number of manuscripts for them is comparatively small. Livy has 27 manuscripts. Compared to the Old Testament and the New Testament, that's really small. Herodotus, 75 manuscripts. That's a respectable number, but still, when you're comparing it to things that are in the tens of thousands, that's not much. Thucydides is down to only 20 manuscripts, and we're 5 centuries out for Thucydides. That's quite a bit of time and not a whole lot of manuscripts. There's not a whole lot of cross-comparing that we can do. with Thucydides's work. It basically is either correct or it isn't. Suetonius, we have better manuscript evidence for, but there's also a really big gap size there. There's a 7th-century gap between when it was written and when we actually get a manuscript from it. And we have about 200 manuscripts, which is good. We can do a lot of cross-comparison with it, but it's pretty far removed from that time. 7 centuries is a pretty long time, historically speaking. Not as much as some people think it is, but it's definitely more than we have for the Bible. The Bible is only 1 or 3 centuries removed. So 7 is more than twice that. Homer is an interesting one. He's not necessarily considered a source of history and not generally considered a source for religion either. His works are usually regarded pretty much just solely as literary works, interesting fiction from the time that reflects the culture or can comment on the culture and this kind of thing. But as far as just being able to study even as literature, we have some problems in that there's about an 8th century gap, and some people argue about that a little bit as to when exactly Homer lived and exactly what counts as a manuscript for him and whatnot. But 8 was the most reliable number that I could find. And his number of manuscripts is actually pretty high. A lot of them are fragmentary, but still, 2,000 manuscripts is a pretty high number. That's comparable to the Quran as far as, having thousands of manuscripts, whereas most of the other works of ancient antiquity usually don't have more than hundreds. So that is definitely a notable thing, but like I said, there's just such a big gap there, 8 centuries, that it kind of balances that out. Now, I put the Book of Mormon on there not because I consider it to be a legitimate ancient work. I don't. I am a biblical historical Christian, and the Book of Mormon is not either biblical or historical, and I don't know of any scholar who looks at history seriously who would consider it to be a true ancient record, just to be blunt. But even if we take the Mormons at their word for it in their claims, they claimed that the Book of Mormon was finished around the 5th century AD, and that Joseph Smith wrote from it was able to make a copy of it in the 19th century. And so that is a 14th century gap between it was actually written and when we actually get a copy of it. And it is a copy, and it's a copy in another language. And the number of actual handwritten manuscripts for it are actually just 2. There's the original transcription by Joseph Smith's scribes, and then there's the printer's version, and that's it. So I find it a little ironic, honestly, when different Mormons, whether they be LDS or RLDS or FLDS, there's different groups. In fact, there's over 80 different Mormon groups that have existed or still exist. And they also have some breakaway groups, like the True Gnostic Church led by Archie Wood, and also Christopher Nemelka's group that believes that they've translated the sealed portion. And if you don't know what that is, that's fine. That's Mormon doctrine and theology and that kind of stuff. But I do want to bring this up because a lot of Mormons think that the Bible is so unreliable compared to the Book of Mormon, and we'll get into that in more detail. But I want to point out that as far as basic historical attestation is concerned, the Book of Mormon is basically worse than anything else that's on this list. Okay, Homer, which is largely considered to be fictitious, is actually historically more reliable than the Book of Mormon is. So we're not even as reliable as a fictitious account is, which is just sad. And of course, the Mormons will claim, well, the Book of Mormon was finished in the 5th century, and then Moroni buried it, and so when Joseph Smith uncovered it in the 19th century, it was a direct connection. There wasn't, this big span of copies of copies of copies in between. But here's the thing: if someone buries something, you don't know that it wasn't tampered with. You don't know that people didn't find it somewhere along the line and find the cache and take things out and put things in, or change things, or take what was there and completely change it out for something else. You don't know that, especially with a gap of 14 centuries in there. I mean, we have the same kind of problem when we come to other ancient ruins and other things that were hidden away in places. Sometimes you'll get grave robbers will find things and they'll take things out and they'll change stuff and put other things in. I mean, we found, modern bottle caps in tombs that we thought had been untouched. But of course, when you find a bottle cap in there, it's pretty obvious that other people had been there first. Either that or you believe that the ancient people were all walking around with a Diet Coke in their hands or something. I'm not sure. But it's very obvious that even things that have been buried are not tamper-proof. And it's very possible that it could be. It's a really long time frame. And the Mormons don't really have a good answer for it. Ultimately, it comes down to faith. They believe that nobody tampered with it. And they believed that that Joseph Smith's translation of the Book of Mormon is at least substantially accurate, because that's what God inspired him to write. And of course, they're also assuming that Moroni, who was the last person on the list of prophets in the Book of Mormon, basically got everything that happened before him, which spans centuries, that he got all of that stuff correct. And they basically say, well, God inspired him to do this, and if anything that came down to him was incorrect, God inspired him to write the right things. And if that's going to be your argument, then there really isn't any point in relying on the text in the first place. Because if God is going to override it and basically re-inspire it every time it comes to another juncture, there's just really no accountability. So I'm sorry to go off on a tirade on that kind of stuff, but I just wanted to point out that for those Mormons out there who think that the Bible is so unreliable compared to their own book, they probably need to study their own book a little bit more and actually get the true facts on it and face those facts. Alright, so next slide number 6. Alright, overall, now this is just a diagram that's kind of a pictographic representation of what was on the other slide. The green represents the number of manuscripts comparatively speaking, and the red represents the gap size, the number of centuries that we're waiting for a manuscript that we actually still have today. And like I said, the Book of Mormon is at the bottom because it has the worst attestation possible. It only had 2 manuscripts and it's a 14th century gap, so comparatively speaking, it's not so good. And of course, at the top of the list, you have the New Testament and the Old Testament. And the Old Testament looks a little bit out of place on this graph because its gap size is actually larger than the Quran's is. However, it also has a lot more manuscripts and a lot more diverse manuscripts, so there's a lot more comparison and cross-checking that you can do with it. So even though the gap size is larger than for the Quran, the many more manuscripts that it has outweighs that, and that's why the Old Testament is above the Quran on that one. That is, if you take the difference in those two distances, the distance that the green is out to the right and the distance that the red is out to the left, that difference comes out to be greater for the Old Testament than for the Quran. So that's why the Old Testament is on top. But like I said, you'll notice that the New Testament and the Old Testament are far and wide much better historically attested to than any other work of ancient antiquity, and even works that come later like the Quran, and other works that frankly are just outright fictions like the Book of Mormon. It still comes out on top of all of that kind of stuff, which is really interesting. So moving on to slide 7 here. Effectively, if we were to reject the Bible on the basis of a supposedly weak degree of historical attestation, it's just so far removed and we just don't have enough manuscript evidence and it's just been all this kind of stuff. If you believe that, well, then you'd also have to reject every other work of ancient antiquity, at least if you're going to be consistent. We don't know that Alexander the Great really existed, or that Julius Caesar existed, or pretty much any other ancient person, because most of the other ancient records are in far worse shape than the Bible is. So if we're going to doubt the historic reliability of the Bible and its historic attestation, well then, frankly, nothing's safe. You don't have any history if that's the case. And frankly, that's actually not all that different from a lot of modern perspectives, and that a lot of modern people tend to believe that they are just, the they are the meet-all, end-all, and that all the other people who were on Earth before them were just stupid or something. I'm not sure what, but there's not a whole lot of respect these days for our history and for what happened in the past, and we sometimes have the very arrogant notion that we can do things better than them. And in some respects that might be true, but that's only so much as we learn from them. Unfortunately, a lot of people don't like to take the time to learn from them. So, unless we're willing to go back to the Dark Ages, effectively, then we would have to accept the Bible as being at least as reliable as these other works of ancient antiquity, and even some that come later. And if it is not at least as reliable, you could actually make a really good argument that it's more reliable. Much smaller gap size, much more in the way of manuscripts and that sort of thing. It's pretty rock solid. Now, there is another claim that I wanted to address that does not get addressed very often in these kinds of presentations. A lot of the presentations will point out that for the Bible, we have a lot of manuscripts, and that the gap size between when the originals were written and when we first start getting manuscripts really isn't that big. Lots of people will mention that, and of course I mention that as well because it's true, and people are often confused about that. For some reason they think that we don't have much in the way of manuscript evidence, which isn't the case. We do. And they'll also think that we're just so far removed from the beginning we couldn't possibly know. We're not actually that far removed from the beginning. But there is a more specific accusation that comes up that I want to address. So again, let's go back to Bart Ehrman. This is what he says in his book Misquoting Jesus that came out in 2005, and this is from the introduction. He says, "Not only do we not have the originals, we don't have the first copies of the originals. We don't even have copies of the copies of the originals, or copies of the copies of the copies of the originals. What we have are copies made later, much later." So what Bart Ehrman here is claiming is essentially that we have at best fourth generation copies. We don't have the copies of the copies of the copies, which means he thinks that we're on fourth generation copies. Now, a lot of Christian apologists who address this issue that I've listened to do not address this particular issue. A lot of times they go more so towards the side of saying, well, even if that is the case, we still have a wide diversity of manuscripts and a really good means of getting back to the original and this kind of thing. And I agree with that. But even if this were true, the Bible would still be in pretty good shape. However, my problem is that I'm not convinced that this is true, to be blatantly honest. But this idea that we're just copies of copies of copies out, and it's just gone through so many changes is a pretty common idea. And in fact, religions have been based on the idea that the Bible is unreliable because of all of the copying. And of course, one of the most notable ones is, again, Mormonism. And they seem to think that we just have, generations of copies of copies of copies of copies of copies out the wazoo. I mean, they just think that it's terrible sometimes, depending on the particular Mormon that you talk to. And so here are a couple quotes from Mormon literature. The first one is from First Nephi, which is in the Book of Mormon. Of course, that's kind of interesting. If you have books within a book, is it still a book? Anyways, it's the same problem that you have with the Bible, though. It's more just a random aside, sorry. But this is from First Nephi, and what it says is this. "And the angel spake unto me, saying, These last records, which thou hast seen among the Gentiles, shall establish the truth of the first, which are of the 12 apostles of the Lamb, and shall make known the plain and precious things which have been taken away from them." So what is it saying in First Nephi? It's saying that the original records that were laid down, those records themselves have come down, but things have been taken away from them. Things have been removed, things have been extracted, things have been taken out. Plain and precious things. These are not just little things, these are essential doctrines. And if you're a Mormon, you would very readily say that there are doctrines and a fullness that people who read the Bible as it's come down through history just don't have, because those things were lost. And Mormons really do believe this. They believe that it was lost, so much so that in their articles of faith, Their eighth article of faith actually basically says that. It says, we believe the Bible to be the Word of God as far as it is translated, which basically means transcribed or transmitted, correctly. So as far as it's translated correctly, so far as it's come down the line correctly. They believe that it's that process of it coming down, of it being translated, of it being moved from one generation to the next, that all kinds of things happened, and that because of that it's not completely reliable. And then they tack on to that, we also believe the Book of Mormon to be the Word of God. But you'll notice that with the Book of Mormon, even though they state it second, they don't put any qualifiers on it. They don't say so far as it is translated correctly. They don't say so far as, Joseph Smith got everything right, or he properly understood it and stuff like that. That's not in the article of faith. It's not so far as it's been translated correctly. That isn't added to the Book of Mormon. They believe that it was the Bible that was corrupted because the Bible is the one that went through all of these different hands. And it's just so far removed, who could possibly know what it said originally? Either way, whether you want to go with Bart Ehrman's statement or with LDS statements and religions like them that attack the veracity of the Bible, like, say, for example, the Muslims or other groups such as that, what they all seem to subscribe to is this idea of kind of a phone game scenario. So here on slide 10, we have that phone game scenario that a lot of people seem to think is the case. That is, just kind of like in the phone game that you play when you're a kid, where one person whispers into the ear of the next person, and the next person in turn whispers into the ear of the next person, on down the line, until it finally gets back around, and of course it's been twisted and mangled in all kinds of horrible ways. And you have to understand that the phone game is not a very good analogy here. And the biggest reason is because the phone game is designed to result in a corrupted message. That is, in the phone game you only tell one person. Could you imagine how it was if you got to tell multiple people and they could interact with each other? And also, you have to hear from the person who is directly in front of you, and you can only tell it to the person who's directly after you. Could you imagine how little problem there would be in the phone game if you got to talk to people who are maybe, 3-4 steps ahead of you, and you got to tell people 3-4 steps after you what it was that you heard? You really wouldn't have a whole lot of a problem. The phone game is designed to result in a corrupted message. But a lot of those premises, especially that idea of being able to check with other people and being able to tell it to multiple people at the same time, it actually do not hold when it comes to how the Bible was actually transmitted down through the ages. But that's how a lot of people seem to think of it. And the X's that are on the diagram here represent what Bart Ehrman seems to think. Now, we would agree with him in that we don't have the blue manuscript here. The blue manuscript on the one that starts in the 1st century is the originals. We would agree with him that we don't have the originals. However, he says that we don't even have the first 3 sets of copies. And that's what he said in the literal sense. And that's what we're challenging here. Alright, so the idea that's out there, and this is slide 11, by the way, the idea here is that significant material was lost or removed in the transcription process. It just changed hands so many times and went through so many different things that, it's been corrupted. But this accusation doesn't hold, and it doesn't hold for 2 primary reasons. First, like we've already mentioned a little bit, no one single group ever controlled all of the biblical manuscripts so as to make wholesale changes to them. That is, if one group were to make a wholesale change, other groups would not follow suit because the groups didn't agree with each other. Why would they all agree on changing the text in the exact same way when they didn't agree with each other on everything? That's just simply not going to happen. In mainstream Christianity, you'd have the Western Christians and the Eastern churches later on. Of course, those groups didn't agree with each other. As time went on, there's some major cultural differences, and there are also certain doctrinal and theological differences that they had. And then there's also some of the other early Christian groups, like the Alexandrian See of Christianity, for example, was particularly potent early on, and they had a different manuscript tradition as well. And then there's also the Syriac versions of Christianity, that frankly are just kind of weird, especially from my perspective, but they did have the biblical manuscripts and they had their own versions of them. So you can't make wholesale changes to them because every group has their own set of scriptures and their own textual tradition. So even if one group does decide to make a change, it's not going to show up in all of the groups. It just simply can't happen that way. And then also you have to remember that some of the biblical manuscripts didn't actually just stay with just Christians. A lot of the Old Testament manuscripts, for example, stayed with the Jews and the Samaritans, and I think there's another group in there as well. But it wasn't just Christians that had control of it as well. And so all of those, any changes that were made by either group would show up because of that. And so you can't go through making wholesale changes just because there's so many different groups that are involved, even from a fairly early point. The different regions would have their own textual traditions. That doesn't necessarily mean that the Christians just horribly disagreed on everything, but they all have their own textual traditions. And you can't go out into the whole world and collect all the manuscripts together and create an official version and change things that you want, because Christianity is just spread so far and so fast. There really is just that kind of control, especially early on, just isn't possible. The imperial church, you might say, that happened later on under Roman Catholicism and to a lesser extent under Eastern Orthodoxy, just simply didn't exist early on. For the first 3 centuries, Christianity was a heavily persecuted religion by the Roman government. The Christians couldn't have got everyone in the world together to talk about these things even if they wanted to. And we have manuscripts that go back back to that time when there was that persecution. And those manuscripts are not substantially different from ones that are later, just the way it is. But second, and this is the point that I really want to drive home here, the number of generations of copies is not so large as to make us dependent on this accretion of gradual errors and changes. That is, if you want to make the argument that we're just so many things have been changed down the line, I'm going to argue that that doesn't work. That is, if you want to claim that there were wholesale changes early on, that doesn't happen just because of the diversity of textual traditions within Christianity. You can't claim that there was a wholesale change early on. So if you instead want to claim that there is this kind of almost microscopic just change after change after change after change that happened, well, then you're going to have to claim that there was a sufficiently long period in which it to happen. I'm going to do my best to answer that kind of accusation. So let's take a look at that in a little bit more detail. Now, if we were to ask skeptics how long they think that the average manuscript lasts, they would probably give a pretty small number based on things that they've said. That is, after all, they think that the best that we have is copies of copies of copies. And that's right from Bar Ehrman himself. So if he's talking about, like, say, P52, for example, which is one of the earliest manuscripts that we have for the New Testament, it's a fragment of the Gospel of John, by the way, and it comes from about 125 AD, give or take probably about 25 years. But if he's thinking of that as being that 4th generation copy that we do have, and taking that John was written somewhere around 90 AD, then that means that he thinks that manuscripts only last about 12 years. Now, if he's talking about complete copies of the Bible, well, then that would be Aleph, that is Codex Sinaiticus, and that's the kind of the weird X-looking one. And that was written around 350 AD. And as far as the complete New Testament being done, we'd say that's done roughly by the end of the 1st century, so we'll just round it off to 100 to make it easy to work with, and that comes out to around 83 years, which is longer, but it's still a comparatively small amount of time compared to the millennia of history that we have between the writings of the New Testament in our own time. Now, I have heard some Christian apologists say that a good copy could last for 200 years. I'm not sure where they get this number from or how they do that calculation, but they say, let's just use 200 years, and they seem to think that's the case. I don't know where they get that number from, but that's a number that is out there. Now, if I were to ask you, though, as the listener, how much would you guess? How long do you think that a manuscript, one of these Greek manuscripts, we're talking specifically about the New Testament here because that's where most of the data is, but similar statements would hold for the Old Testament as well. How long do you think that these manuscripts would last on average? Would you side with that really conservative estimate of 12 years? Kind of a middle road of 83 years? Would you be one of the ones to say possibly 200 years? Well, it turns out that this is a testable claim, so slide 13. We can take the manuscripts that we now have and we can ask the basic question. How long have they lasted? How long does a manuscript last? Now, what we're going to use for this is the Nestle-Aland 28th edition. This is a critical edition of the Greek New Testament that is based on about 421 manuscripts. And I have a little diagram on the screen here for you guys, and you can see that most of the manuscripts that it uses are from the first millennium. There are some that it uses that are from the second millennium as well, but most of the time when you look at its citations, it'll cite the first millennium ones first, and then the second millennium ones after. Just to have, like most critical editions of the Greek New Testament, greater weight is given to the early stuff rather than the later stuff. Now, if we were actually, and of course down at the bottom of this, you can see the actual age of the manuscripts, and this is in centuries. Based on this, you can get an average age. Turns out, slide 14 here, turns out that average age is about 12.5 centuries, which is a really long time when you think about it. That's over a millennium that these manuscripts that are used for our modern critical edition of the New Testament has lasted. That's a really long time for a piece of paper. And of course, not all of them are paper. But generally, any kind of writing material that's soft, a lot of people wouldn't expect that it would last that long. Now, I do want to point out, though, that the Nestle-Aland is based on significant manuscripts. It's based basically on well-preserved manuscripts, either manuscripts that have been intentionally well-preserved or sometimes unintentionally. That is, they got buried and people kind of forgot about it, or they got put in the back part of a library and people, forgot that they were there and that kind of thing. But either way, these are relatively well-preserved. So that number would reflect what would be true of a manuscript that you were very intentional about keeping around. But that, of course, is not representative of all of the manuscripts that are out there. So let's take all of the Greek New Testament manuscripts, there's about 5,700 of them, and figure out an average for those. Well, about 95% of them that we have are later manuscripts. And you can date them to roughly, on average, about 6 centuries from our own time. The other 5% you can date to roughly 14 centuries from our own time. And so the average for that comes out to be about 640 years, which is still a lot longer than most people would believe. So what this means, though, is even if we go with the lower number, the 640 instead of the 1250, even if we decide to go with that number and we assume that we're dealing with manuscripts that are on the tail end of when manuscripts are being written, and we don't really have many manuscripts that are being written after the 18th century. And so if we go with that, this means that we are at our worst possible case 3 generations out. That is, the manuscripts that were written in the 18th century could very well be based on manuscripts that, in the worst case, are based on manuscripts that were around during the turn of the millennium. Now, in the best case, we have manuscripts that go well before the 18th century. We have manuscripts from the 2nd, 3rd, 4th century. We have really early manuscripts that would be well within this first generation of copies. So this means that in reality, we're actually only 1 to 3 generations out of corrected copies, of copies that can be corrected by other manuscripts that are still around. And for the Old Testament, this is pretty close to the same, except that we're about 1 more generation out for the Old Testament. That is, our Old Testament manuscripts that we tend to use are first millennium manuscripts, or ones that are really close to that time interval, like the Leningrad Codex and the Aleppo Codex for the Hebrew, and for the Greek, which is a major tradition for the Old Testament. Those ones come from the middle of the first millennium. And there are actually some of the manuscripts that go all the way back to the 2nd century BC. So we can't get quite as close to the original with the Old Testament, but still, we're only 2 or 3 generations out, provided that these averages hold. So, bearing this in mind, what actually happens during the transcription of these manuscripts, I tried to represent here in slide 15 for you guys. It's not like the phone game. That's the main point here. That is, copies are made, but there are multiple copies that are made that go out to different places, and so they all have their own textual tradition. Now, exactly how many different textual traditions there are for the different books of the Bible and the different testaments, we don't have exact numbers on. We know it's a lot, but we don't know the exact numbers. To simplify things for you guys, I just made it into 2 different spirals here. There's the kind of the red and pink spiral, and then there's the black and the gray spiral, and each of those represent a different textual tradition. That is, they made a copy and they went off and started making copies from it. And there was actually a lot of different spirals that you would have, but to get something anywhere near an accurate representation, this would basically just become a blob, and nobody would be able to make heads or tails of it. So the originals, there were multiple copies of them that went out to different places. Then, of course, you start getting the copies of the copies. But when you make a copy, it's not like you get rid of the first one. That first one could be around for quite a long time, and as we saw for the manuscripts that we have, they could be around for, the short average is 640 years. The long average, if you were very intentional about keeping this thing around, it could be 12.5 centuries. And so even though you have these different manuscripts that are being made along the way, as you go out in the spiral, you get to a different step on the spiral. That's another copy. But that copy and what it was made from exist alongside each other for a really long time. And so they're able to compare each other. And even copies that are, 3 or 4 centuries down the road are still able to go back to those first copies and compare. And so what we have is, at the worst case, only basically 3 generations. And the little green bands that are on this diagram represent a break from one generation to the next generation, where everything preceding it could reference back to that first one, and then after that you lose being able to reference the first one again. But that's only a total of 3 generations. It's not nearly as bad as Bart Ehrman and some of the other people would like to paint that it is. And like I said, this is well ahead of most ancient documents. Some of the ancient documents, like I said, there's like a millennium gap between when they were written and you start getting manuscripts for them. And that millennium gap is definitely at the high end of how long a manuscript can last. And it's certainly past the low average of 640 years. So the point here is that there's multiple traditions, and within each tradition, the manuscripts can talk to each other. So this isn't the phone game where just one person whispers into the ear of the person right next to them, and you can only hear from the person who's right in front of you in line. It's not like that. Instead, you get to tell multiple people going out in different lines, and the different lines get to talk to each other along the way. And not only are you going to be able to tell the person who's directly ahead of you, but you could talk to people, let's say, 6 people ahead of you, and they could talk to people who are 6 people ahead of them. And you get to talk back and forth. The odds of significantly messing up the message by the time you're done with all of that and with all the cross-checking that's possible, it's pretty much nil. It really is. There's no reason to believe that it's actually problematic. Alright, so, as to the New Testament, this is even more significant. In the diagram that I just gave you guys, I put the originals in the center, and I didn't actually talk about how long they lasted. Right now, all I've really been talking about is the copies. How long do copies last? And we said the average is somewhere for the common copy is probably around 640 years, but for a carefully preserved copy, whether it's carefully preserved intentionally or accidentally, it could be as high as 12.5 centuries. But does that hold for the originals? Well, if it holds for the copies, we would expect that it would be true of the originals, and if it's true of the originals, we'd expect to find some historical evidence for it, and that's actually exactly what we find. I have to admit, I've actually been really disappointed to listen to some Christian apologists who will say, the originals never made it out of the first century. And I'm sitting there thinking, on what kind of basis do you say that? Because if you actually look through the history, you'll actually find church fathers talking about going back to the originals. And these were not church fathers who were writing in the first century. These are church fathers who were writing, say, as late as the 4th and 5th centuries. Like Augustine, for example. In his work Contra Faustum, section 11, part 2, he says that the scribes of his day, that the people who were looking at the text in his time, would occasionally refer back to the originals if they had a question about some reading in the text. Now, he wrote this around 400 AD, the gap between the 4th and the 5th centuries. That is an amazing thought, that even that late, they still had access to the originals. This is also important because we actually have a good number of manuscripts that come before that date. In fact, we have at least 95. We might be discovering a few more as time goes on, but we know that we have at least 95 Greek New Testament manuscripts that come from 400 AD or before. And some of them, like Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, are complete New Testaments, which means that we have New Testaments, complete New Testaments, that were written at the same time that the originals were around. Now, that doesn't mean that every copy was based on the original, but what it means is that some of the copies were corrected to the originals, and we know that some of them were. So in that entire corpus, it might not necessarily be every manuscript, but in that entire corpus of text, the original reading is going to be in there somewhere. And that's a nice thing. The corpus of the New Testament text is a conservative corpus. That is, when variant readings occurred, what scribes did more often than not, instead of picking one reading over the other one, what they instead did a lot of times is they would actually merge them together. And when we talk about some of the specific variants, we'll actually see that. They'll take two different readings and they'll actually merge them into one reading. And that's because they didn't want to lose the original material. So instead of saying this one's authentic and this one isn't, a lot of times they would actually just represent it all together and just put them all there so that whatever the original was would be preserved. And of course, similar statements are going to hold for the Old Testament, but we are about one step further removed from the Old Testament than the New Testament. All right, so what has been the overall point of this relatively long discussion? Well, it's pretty simple. First of all, the Bible is on really good standing, historically speaking. You take any other work of ancient antiquity and compare it to the Bible, and the Bible is going to come out on top. We have very early attestation for it, comparatively speaking, and we also have a lot more manuscripts that we can compare and cross-check. The transcription process that the Bible went through was not like the phone game. Instead, unlike the phone game, you had the text going out in multiple places, and those multiple places would check on each other from time to time, and they could compare to one another. And we look at all of these different textual traditions, and we compare them against each other now in the modern. Also, it isn't the case that, after a copy was made, that whatever the copy was made from was suddenly, lost or burnt or something like that. Instead, those preceding copies were actually kept around for a pretty long time, and we see that they could actually last a very long time. And so you don't have this reliance on the person who comes right before you in line. Instead, you can rely on someone who's 6 steps ahead of you in the line if you're not sure that the person directly in front of you got it right. So it's not like the phone game at all. There's a very good reason to believe that it's accurate. And hopefully that's the point that I got across here for you guys. You've been very patient, and you might be kind of on overload right now, and it's a lot of material to take in. So I'm going to stop for now, and then we'll pick up on part 2 at a later date. Thank you very much for your time. God bless you and keep you. Amen.